today on Every Day in Justice, we have Olinda Moyd, who has spent a few decades as a public defender and is also now at Howard University. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
So maybe just as background, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are now.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I am a native Baltimorean, born and raised in Baltimore, and decided through the influence of a teacher in undergrad to go to law school. I attended the Ohio State University School of Law. And one of the first jobs that I had after law school was to work with the NAACP, the national office, when they moved part of the office from New York to Baltimore. And it was at that time that I began to receive information, letters from men and women who were behind bars throughout the US in prisons and jails. Even though we worked on employment discrimination, housing discrimination, a wide variety of civil rights matters at the NAACP office, I was the one who was designated to answer prison mail as the paralegal working in the office. And so it was then that I began to see through the lens of the men and women who wrote us what was happening behind bars. I then left the NAACP and went to work with the ACLU National Prison Project. And so it was there that I then got an opportunity not just to see what was going on behind bars, but also to do something about it. We probably sued every state in the union regarding their maltreatment of men and women who were in custody and their constitutional violations regarding their treatment. I stayed there for 3.5 years and then went to work with the DC Public Defender Service. At the time that I was hired, we had a prisoners' rights office. And so we were located inside one of the local prisons that was right outside of DC. We catered to the needs that men and women had behind bars. We filed individual actions as well as class action lawsuits. We also represented men and women who were facing disciplinary infractions inside the institution. So we also did those administrative hearings. A few years after doing that, somewhere around six years in, the agency, the Public Defender Service, decided that we would focus on representing men and women at parole hearings, parole revocation hearings. So for most of the time that I was at the DC Public Defender Service, I spent that time representing men and women who were facing revocation of their parole or supervised release before the U.S. Parole Commission, because there's not a local parole board in the district. Those cases were heard before the U.S. Parole Commission. And so I stayed at the Public Defender Service for 30 years. And it was after that time that I was approached by a professor at Howard's Law School who asked me if I would be interested in teaching the reentry clinic. And I've done that for the last 2 years. So my, experience is kind of, all over the place in terms of individual representation, as well as class action representation, and now teaching.
So what's interesting, kind of reading some of your writing and some other things is the focus on parole, I think, is unique. And I don't think a lot of people think about how important a function parole revocation actually is in terms of mass incarceration. And so how did you get into that specific subfield?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We focus a lot on the fact that 2.3, and I understand that it's probably down to 2.2 million people are behind bars in this country. But we don't focus on the fact that we've also got 5 million people who are on probation, parole, or supervised release. And the fact that any minor violation can just land a person back in jail. So when we look at the intakes in the different courts that happen like on a regular basis, a large number of the people who are presented to court and then sent to jail or prison are individuals who are on parole or supervised release. Unfortunately, in most jurisdictions, the number of people who are sent back to jail for violations are not sent back to jail for committing new crimes. Certainly they would have you think otherwise, right? That the number of people who are violated because they're committing new crimes, and that the crimes in our community are being committed by people who are on parole or supervised release. When the reality is more than half of the individuals, and it's different in different jurisdictions. In DC, it's more than 60 to 70% of the individuals who are violated for technical violations. That means not reporting to a parole officer, or missing a meeting, or not going to a program, or failing a drug test, suffering with addiction, or not going to your mental health provider. So those are some of the reasons why, again, folks land themselves back in jail. And it is a forgotten practice, right? We don't talk about that much. We don't talk about the repressive state that's created by having millions of people on surveillance, under supervision in the community, but still under surveillance. And you will note that in my article, I state that it's akin to the time when, after the Civil War, when formerly enslaved people had to walk around with their papers to show that they were legitimate in the community, right? I hear clients now talk about being on papers, having to show that you are legitimate, rightfully so, in the community.
And I've covered a number of parole issues where people commit very minor technical violations. And one guy I worked with, he ended up sentenced spending 3 more years in prison for a technical violation. He gets out and they start doing it again. And this time he was smart. He got an aggressive lawyer and he ended up beating it. But so many people end up back in prison when they haven't committed a new crime. I think one of the issues that you raise is that because these are technical violations, this creates a huge amount of discretion on the part of the agencies that are in charge of this. And so that helps to create a huge racial disparity in terms of who ends up being recommitted based on a technical violation.
That's absolutely correct. And when we look at who the decision makers are in most jurisdictions, they are not people that come from the community. Most of them have law enforcement backgrounds. Many of them have been parole officers. And so they bring with them the biases and the philosophy of running these parole boards like a person who, again, comes from that background.
And there's another aspect to this. You write in one of your essays, parole boards are fragmented institutions that operate in fear of releasing the wrong person. And so they end up erring on the other extreme and deny release to people that really do deserve a second chance. What do you see as the implications for that?
So I think we see that on so many levels, right? We see and as a person who practiced in this field for many years, it was routine that I would hear parole officers say, I am going to request a warrant. I'm going to write you up and request a warrant because you're not going to see my name in the paper. We would hear that like all the time. I am not going to be the person blamed for releasing the wrong person or releasing someone who might do something in the community. The problem with that, if you operate from that mindset, is it impacts decisions all throughout the parole process, right? So we're not just denying parole to people who should be granted parole and released to the community, many of them after serving decades, many, many years in prison. It also shows up in the revocation context, right? So we have a person who is facing revocation for a minor offense or minor violation, and that decision-making mentality creeps in. But also we're seeing it at the tail end where a person is supposed to have their parole or supervised release terminated or ended. And we see that folks are still being kept on parole or supervised release much longer than they should be. And so we see this philosophy, this mentality creeping into the process on so many levels.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because last week I interviewed Dan Cannon and we were looking at a completely different issue, but he called this the Peter Parker syndrome because what happens is, and the analogy is from Spider-Man, right, where Peter Parker, is upset and ends up not stopping this thief that ends up fleeing the scene and basically says, hey, it's not my problem. And then the thief ends up being the one that kills his uncle. And, the lesson there is that you want to avoid releasing the person that does the bad deed. And, he used the example of Willie Horton and pointed out that, the Massachusetts furlough program had an extraordinarily good record.
Right.
And Willie Horton was actually one of only 2 people that actually committed a crime, but because it got all the attention, it blew up the whole program. And it seems like the entire criminal legal system is scared to death of the Willie Horton or the exemplar. Out here in San Francisco, it's Troy McAllister that's leading Chesa Bodine, the San Francisco DA, to a possible recall because he released the wrong person.
Yeah, we see that all the time, unfortunately. We never hear about the success stories, right? We never hear about the many, many individuals who are released on parole and just do wonderful things in the community. In the state of Maryland, there was a decision that was made regarding the release of folks after they've served a certain time. And it came about because they found out that improper jury instructions were given to many people who were sentenced during this certain time period. And so they began to release many of the individuals who were sentenced to life, to serve life sentences, who had been in custody for 30, 40 years. They're called the Unger people released as a result of the Unger decision. And there have been reports done by the Justice Policy Institute that talks about the wonderful things that this population is doing in the community. The low recidivism rate, I think something like maybe 2 of the 191 individuals who were released under the Unger decision have been returned to prison. But we don't hear about the success stories. We hear about the 1 or 2 failures that happen, and that guides how decisions are made. And that should not be the case.
And then there's another issue that you raise, which I think is a problem throughout the system as well. It's this notion of risk assessment. And we have this idea that we can properly assess risk, but introducing risk assessment also introduces inherent biases, right?
Absolutely. And there are experts that talk about, whether we should do away with the risk assessment. And if we do away with the risk assessment, how do we get decision makers to make decisions that are objective, right? Like fair and just and void of any kind of internal inherent bias. But we look at when we look at the risk assessments, no matter where they're used several times throughout the criminal legal process. I don't call it the criminal justice process, but throughout the criminal legal process, the risk assessments are used to determine whether a person should be released pre-trial, to determine what level of supervision a person should get, to determine even in the institution what security level a person should be placed on. We use these risk assessments throughout the entire process. But yes, these risk assessments have issues, they have problems. How do we capture, by throwing into this magical formula, everything about a person, right? Like, how do we capture how much danger I might pose to the community by throwing in factors like my race, my age, like those things about me that I can never change, right? The experts talk about dynamic versus static factors. Those static factors are things about me that I can never change. I can never change my age. I cannot change my race. I can't change how many times I have been arrested. I can't change the age I was at the time that I first got my first arrest. And so when you look at the risk assessments that are used, many of them include those static factors, those things that you can never change. The other thing about using those static factors are there are influences that create the point that a person would get that you have no control over, right? So if I live in a community where the risk assessment measures how many contacts I've had with the police, and I live in a community that's over-policed, then my score is going to be impacted by that. I can't control that. The experts talk about using things like dynamic factors. What are the things about me that I can control, right? I can control whether I got my GED while I was in prison. I should get a point for that. I can control whether I participated in programming. I can control the influence that I might have on others who are incarcerated with me. I can control my participation in self-help groups and education. Like, those are things that should be captured in the risk assessment, as opposed to things, again, about myself that I can never change. And so experts have been debating back and forth about this whole, the use of risk assessment, and then if we're going to use them, what should be included.
You know, what I was going to say is, it seems like you're making the case that we need to redo how we do the risk assessment rather than do away with it.
So there are experts that, yes, talk about, first of all, many of the jurisdictions use a risk assessment that has not been adopted for the population. And they start using these risk assessments and they just continue to use them over and over and over and over. There's no revalidation, which all of the experts talk about. If you use a risk assessment, it should be revalidated, reevaluated, and revalidated after a certain time period, because there are changes that happen in the community. There are changes that happen with the population that the risk assessment is used on. And so, yes, there are experts that also talk about, we don't need to do away with it. We need to enhance the risk assessment tools that are already out there.
And I guess I come down in that boat too, because, it seems like there needs to be some way to evaluate if you release somebody, are they going to be a threat to the community? Mm-hmm. And it also seems like there should be some way to evaluate that threat that's relatively objective. And I understand that any measure is going to have areas mm-hmm. of subjectivity, which I agree is problematic.
Yeah.
But, it seems like, from what I've read at least, a lot of this is heavily racially biased and class biased, mm-hmm. And puts certain people at a huge disadvantage to getting out when they may actually not pose much of a risk. Some of this comes back to the fact that, these people are all risk averse, and, if push comes to shove, they'd rather just keep somebody in because, it covers their rear end, right?
Yes, absolutely. I can't tell you how many hearings that I've done where the outcome is, and it's in writing, you've done very well. You've completed all the programming that we recommended, but we think you need more time. And this is for someone who has been in for decades, who has not had any institutional infractions, who has done everything that the parole board asked them to do. You go up for a parole hearing, they say, we're going to deny you parole, go back and do a certain program. The person has completed everything that the parole board has recommended. The only thing they could say this last time that we went up for a hearing is, we believe you need more time. Well, that to me is code for, we don't want to take the risk.
Yeah, it seems like it. And I've met people that are formerly incarcerated that have just done an amazing job of turning their life around and getting education and getting job training and finding a purpose in life. And for me, those people are very low risk when they get out, especially if they have a support network. I also think that, we create a lot of problems for people that are released that they don't have to have. Some of the prohibitions against felony, former felons getting released and getting jobs and getting, government assistance and all sorts of housing and things like that. Are we trying to make it so that they're going to commit another crime? Because it seems like we've created the system to keep them in.
Yes, that is so critical. If someone were to look at our system and look at how we treat people who are returning to the community, you're absolutely right. It looks like we're setting up a permanent second-class citizenry, like a citizenry that we want to just kind of push aside and never give opportunities to. And it's surprising and always refreshing when I see people who can navigate that system and be successful, because it really is set up so that the opposite would happen. When you look at the conditions, first of all, that a person is required to abide by, how many of us could really abide by those conditions? leaving your job twice a week to go and submit a urine test, leaving your job, if you get a job, right, to go and meet with a parole officer. Everybody starts off in DC twice a week, then you work your way down. Having to get a babysitter so that you can go and participate in a treatment program. Like when you think about the conditions, not leaving the jurisdiction without permission. Like I had a client who I write about who was getting his CDL license. He was just so excited to be able to get his CDL license. He had failed the test initially and then finally passed the test. He was so excited to call his parole officer and tell her, I passed my CDL license. My boss wants to send me on my first out-of-state trip to take a load to Virginia. This is somebody on supervision in Maryland, just going across the bridge to Virginia. And the first thing she said to him was, you cannot do it because you cannot leave the jurisdiction without permission. So first of all, the conditions that a person has to abide by are just very onerous. And then, as you said, just thinking about all of the collateral consequences. If your family is in public housing, you can't live in public housing and be on papers at the same time. If you have or want to get an occupational or professional license, that's another hurdle that you have to overcome to get past the criminal background check. All of the things that work against a person, yes, it appears that it's set up so that people will fail as opposed to succeed.
Yeah, and you just reminded me, watching like the Brian Banks story, one of the interesting parts about him getting parole was he was on GPS for a couple of years, and basically every 8 hours he had to be home to plug in the unit.
Yeah.
And then he was kind of tethered to the wall for like an hour or two at a time while it recharged. I mean, don't even think about that kind of stuff.
Yes. I don't know if you saw the movie Blindsided, but we saw some of that also in that movie. Yes, and think about our clients who are in the community who are homeless, right? So they have to find a place to go and charge their device for 30 minutes or however long it takes for the device to charge. And you're right, people don't think about those things. You don't think about those things because we just go on with our daily lives, and we don't think about the way that these conditions are so restrictive to people who are subjected to them.
Yeah, and just another example. My wife was a union organizer and was flown, 15 years ago to Houston to unionize the janitors, and they end up in the middle of the street, chained together, and they all got arrested, which in Texas is kind of an interesting experience unto itself. But one of the interesting things, she ended up, pleading to a misdemeanor, which we didn't think much of at the time, until 3 years later when we wanted to adopt a child. And all of a sudden we had to write to the DOJ to get a waiver to be able to adopt a child. And that's just for a misdemeanor from one of the most innocuous offenses that you could ever imagine, given that it involved her job.
Right.
And I can't even imagine, what people who have more serious records, have to go through.
Yes. It's very, very onerous. I have people who I've represented who are older gentlemen who are, who talk about being scared of going on supervision. I am scared to go on supervision, not because I feel like I'm unprepared for the world, but because I know how challenging it will be to abide by these conditions. And I know that I have so many strikes against me, like the stigma of going into the world and having this scarlet letter on your back, returning citizen. It's very frightening.
And that gets me back to a point that we were talking about earlier, which is that most of the people that are facing revocation are not doing it because they committed new crimes. They're doing it for technical violations of their conditions of release. And why is that? I mean, I can understand why you would want to put somebody back into prison who committed a new crime. But somebody who committed a technical violation would seem to be more along the lines of a warning or changing the requirements or something. Why are we putting people back in a cage for that?
Well, it goes back to what you stated earlier, and that's that risk. So folks are afraid to take a risk. And as the parole officers used to say to us all the time, you're not going to see my name in the paper. So just thinking about in DC, at the DC jail on any given day, 1/3 of the population at the DC jail are folks who are sitting there on technical violations. Not folks who are sitting there for new crimes, but folks who are sitting there as parole violators. And so what we see is there's also been a change in the mindset of the supervision officers, right? The folks who are monitoring, and that's what they do. They surveil and monitor, as opposed to provide resources and support. They surveil and monitor. The millions of people who are on parole or supervised release and probation. And so there was a time when individuals would enter this career to be a parole officer because they had social work background, they had the idea that they wanted to help people, to support folks as they were getting on their feet. Much of that has changed, not just locally, but throughout the country. And so the mindset now is very akin to law enforcement. And you see in some jurisdictions, parole officers are carrying weapons and they come to your house and they do the check-ins and they come with law enforcement. So what we've seen is a moving away from the social work aspect of this job, parole officer's job, to moving more towards law enforcement. And so that's why we see if you do something wrong, you're going to jail. Like that's the answer for everything. I'm going to write this report. I'm going to request a warrant, even though the statute on the federal level says there are several actions that you can take. You can put the person in the halfway house. You can increase their reporting requirements. You can impose graduated sanctions. There are several other options for most paroling supervision agencies. The option they see is I'm going to write this warrant request and I'm going to send you back to jail.
So it sounds like your view of the solution to this is to move back toward a more social worker model of post-release supervision.
Yes, absolutely. There are experts who've been writing about this for a long time. You were right to say that it's not a often spoken about area of practice, but there are people who've been writing about parole supervision and what it should look like. And all agree that the supervision conditions should be narrowly tailored to achieve a certain goal, right? You shouldn't impose this one size fits all conditions on everybody who walks out of jail. They should be narrowly tailored to achieve a certain goal. And once that goal is achieved, supervision should end. We don't need to over supervise people. So yes, that is one area that would move us in the direction that we need to go in, as opposed to continuing along this path of just reincarcerating people.
Yeah, and I think you bring up another good point here when you talk about narrowly tailored. The case I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why the guy was facing revocation is he called one of his old friends from incarceration on the phone and talked to him. And it turned out, unbeknownst to him, that this guy was a gang member. And one of his conditions of release was no communication with gang members. But why does that make sense? This guy was arrested for drunk driving. He never had a gang charge. And so, ultimately, the reason why he beat the case was that the judge ruled, hey, wait a second, this doesn't even make any sense. This shouldn't even be a condition of release. And so, you see, like, I get it. Like, you get the guy who's convicted of molesting a child, and one of his conditions is he doesn't get on the internet. Okay, yeah, right. That makes sense, right?
Right. Or don't go around a school. I get that. Yeah.
Yeah. But some of these are really ridiculous.
Yeah. And you're so right. Like the conditions that they just impose blanketly on everyone are, in your words, ridiculous. There is a condition that you not associate with other people who are on supervision. For some of our clients, what that means is I can't go back to my family home because there's someone else in the residence that's on supervision. And so we go to the shelter and we talk to folks about, why are you in the shelter? And we find that it's because, someone else in my household is on supervision, so we can't associate.
And of course, the shelter is half filled with people on supervision.
Absolutely, because family members die while you're in prison. You're in prison for decades. Family members die. Family members move. I have to be supervised in the jurisdiction where where the offense occurred. And so I can't just up and move with my family and go to Florida where they now live. I have to be supervised in Maryland or DC. And so I have to find some way to stay. So I wound up at the shelter.
Yeah, and you have the same problem with like gang affiliation, with those provisions that prevents a lot of people from returning to home where they have shelter, they have support, they may have resources. And so, some of these are ridiculous. Some of these are actually, they make sense, except when you start picturing what the actual reality of the world that they live in looks like. And so once you start looking at that, that doesn't make sense either.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some jurisdictions that are looking at the list of conditions that have been imposed, and they are thinking about what really matters and how can we cut the list down. I mean, there are some conditions that, should be imposed. Don't commit any new crimes, right? Like, don't get a new conviction, right? Because an arrest alone can happen without you having any control over that. But don't get a new conviction. Make sure your parole officer knows how to reach you or where you are. Like, there are some conditions that should be imposed, but there are so many conditions that really need to be revised, and the jurisdictions need to take a look at it. I look at the list of conditions that are imposed in the District of Columbia, and I always say the list gets longer every time I look at it. It's like up to 23 conditions now. And I think it's important for jurisdictions to take a step back and think about, do we really need to impose all of these conditions? Are we providing support to people as they are getting back on their feet, or are these conditions serving as a hindrance?
Yeah, and I think, one suggestion I would have to those listening is, if you want to get a sense for just how long these list of conditions are, watch a sentencing hearing where somebody's sentenced to probation, which has similar conditions as parole.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And listen to just how long that judge will go on about all the conditions, because they have to say it out loud. And sometimes you'll listen to the judge go on for 10 minutes just listing all the conditions and all the things. And you're like, how in the world is anyone going to remember all that to make sure that they abide by it all?
Yeah. And how am I going to get my life back on track when I have to abide by all of these conditions? Yes.
Yeah, that's really, my biggest problem. Well, maybe not my biggest problem, but one of my biggest problems is that we make this system so that people that really do mean to get themselves back on track can't, because they just fall short of these requirements. And, I always get these people, oh, well, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. And I'm like, okay, but once they've done the crime, shouldn't they have a way to get their life back in order?
Yes. So I've done the time, and yes, shouldn't I be given a opportunity to be successful in the community? Like, how do I have to be punished for this offense for the rest of my life?
Well, we're just about out of time. Any closing thoughts of things I haven't asked you that you're burning to say?
I would just urge folks to look at, there's one case that recently came up, the story of Gwen Levi. She's a 71-year-old woman in the state of Maryland who was released and went to a computer program class. Her parole officer called her while she was in class, and because she did not answer the phone immediately, she wound up back in prison. And thankfully, because of public outcry and because of advocacy done by a lot of people, she was released to the community. But you think about a 71-year-old grandmother going back to jail for something so minor. That's the society that we live in. That's the system that we have created.
That was Olinda Moyd, faculty member at Howard and a longtime public defender. And we've been talking about the parole system and all of its problems. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.